All right, everyone, we're going to jump into our final presentation of the day. We welcome Margaret Pierson and Michael Johnson to stage for a fireside chat discussing the development of data-driven culture. Margaret Pierson is an Associate Director of Profitability and Pricing at Wayfair. She holds a PhD in Operations Management from Columbia University and spent time as a professor at Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth before moving into industry. Prior to Wayfair, she led teams in last mile delivery, HR, and customer behavior analytics at Amazon.
All right, and then Michael Johnson has led teams building machine learning-driven products in semiconductor manufacturing, aerospace, defense, and now at HelloFresh. He's developed ML applications ranging from satellite imagery to supply chain risk analysis, and built and led and coached machine learning focused teams that are embedded within functions, as well as teams that are centralized and at enterprise scale. He holds a BS in engineering physics from the Colorado School of Mines, as well as an MS in electrical engineering from UVM. So without further ado, our fireside chat on data-driven culture.
Thanks for the introduction. Margaret, you want to talk about your team?
Sure. So I'll start us off. I'm in charge of an organization of about 30 folks, scientists, analysts, and product managers at Wayfair. Our team supports, started off supporting pricing, so we forecast all the cost side of our margin equation in order to price to obtain a desired margin. And then over time, we've expanded that scope to forecasting profit on orders that have occurred, right? So a lot of our costs don't land right away, and so we have to figure out like what's the likelihood that somebody's going to return this thing, or that it breaks on delivery, etc. And that gets used in finance and reporting as well as bidding, paid search bidding. Yep. And then we have expanded our scope beyond that to think about how to forecast profitability and use that in our recommendation systems so that we consider not just conversion but also the long-term profit implications of that conversion. And then my team also does like random skunkworks projects like how should we think about the trade-off between speed and on-time delivery when we decide what promise day to give customers when they're going to make an order, and so random causal projects that there's not causal people elsewhere to work on. What about you?
Yeah, so at HelloFresh, like my team works sort of across the customer journey. So like obviously, or maybe not so obviously, HelloFresh is like a meal kit company. They send you food that you have to cook. They also send you food that you don't have to cook in case you're interested in that as well, because cooking food takes a long time. But and so like if you think about the customer journey, like up front, we develop models that like we have a direct mail model. So if you get flyers, it's because we predicted that you should get them and that you might be a profitable customer. So congratulations. If you don't, try not to read into that too hard. But we do other sort of marketing things similar to what you have. We have profitability models that are used in various domains of targeted marketing, as well as like experiment acceleration. And then when you get into the product, we have a variety of things that we're working on there. So one is a recommendation engine, and at its core is like a taste profile, like a numeric taste profile. So these are learned embeddings, distributed representations, if you will. And we use those for a variety of different applications, including recommendations for recipes week over week based on your customer taste profile, as well as menu planning, which is a really complicated thing. We have to take 100,000 possible recipes and pick the best 30 for this week and do that over a span of time and account for supply chain and all sorts of other constraints. So it's a really interesting problem. We do other things in that process, fraud detection, that sort of thing. And then once we have like lots of former customers as well, and so there's sort of like reactivation, personalization that also sits on top of our recommendation engines and other stuff. So underneath all of that is operations. And so how do you send 1 million boxes per week to a whole bunch of different customers with a variety of supply chain constraints? And we have lots of models in that domain as well. So
Cool. A lot of stuff.
Yeah. So obviously a component of both of our companies is data. It's a key component. We happen to be in those domains. So like how would you define a data-driven culture?
Sure, happy to take that. I have a very quick answer, and I know you have a much more nuanced one. So
Sure.
when we were talking about it ahead of time, my quick answer on data-driven culture was, when an executive has intuition and the numbers say something different, who wins, right? And if the numbers win, then you have a data-driven culture. And if the intuition of the head person wins, then you don't. So that was my quick answer, but I think you had some more thoughts there.
Yeah, no, I think data-driven means lots of things. It doesn't, I think, in my opinion, it doesn't always mean machine learning driven. I know like the McKinsey presentation showed that like if you're early maturity, you build dashboards, but I actually think that's just part of the maturity process, right? And so I think that up front, a lot in most domains, like 80% of the initial value you get is actually out of just comprehending and understanding your data, which often comes through visualization and analytics. And that's actually a pretty difficult thing. And so I think having the proper like tooling for whatever stage you are in your development process as a company, I think is really important. And we could talk about infrastructure components, and we'll get into sort of org structures and how that might cascade out. But the other thing is like there's an element of a data-driven culture, which I think is just like experiment-driven. So along the lines of what you're saying, we happen to be both in fields where you can do experiments. I've been in fields where it's much more difficult. Like you can only build so many F-35s, and so A/B testing them is quite a difficult thing to do. I think like we're really fortunate in that, and so like having experimentation as a priority is really important. But then obviously like how do you just make business decisions in general is an important part of like data drivenness. That's actually one of our cultural values. And so I think there's lots of like interesting nuances around making sure that you set up an organization that's structured around making decisions based on information, and that information might come in the form of a stream of data, and that information might come in the form of qualitative data that you collect about a given process or decision. So, like one of the things you brought up is like, okay, if the executive and the numbers say something different, who wins? Like, how do you address that situation? Like, if you're in a situation where there's a strong intuitive component and there's a strong like data-driven component, and they disagree, how do you reconcile those?
Yeah, I'll start off with like what not to do, which is what I did when I was early on in this journey, which was like blind them with science, right? Like, you like go into like, oh, like I'm going to compel you that I'm right by telling you how smart I am in like 100 different diagrams and fancy models, and that is probably the very worst idea. Like nothing inspires distrust like giving a presentation to an executive that they understand no piece of.
Right, using words people don't understand.
Right, and like just trying to say, it's very obvious what you're trying to do there, and so while that like works in an academic presentation as like the table stakes to kind of set the stage is a terrible idea. So I'd say like the dead simple like justification metric, right? Like what's the very simplest metric you can give that will like say that their intuition is off, right?
Right.
So like get really simple, and then find anecdotes that agree with you, right? Like find that customer feedback, find that it's a simple story. So like break down the intuition by building up a different intuition. And you're not always going to want to use like anecdotes to make decisions, but they can be really powerful when they agree with your data to sort of say like here's why this makes sense.
Yeah, I totally like echo that. And talking about the academic thing, like I think academic presentations are almost a game such that you do the presentation in a way using words that are so sophisticated that people would be embarrassed to ask questions because they might look foolish. That's a super bad way to execute and build trust with your business stakeholders, even though it might be a useful way to sort of fend off questions about your master's thesis or something like that.
Right.
Like just one like piece I think to add on to that, we just actually had a situation where one of our stakeholders, we did an experiment and it came out misaligned with what the stakeholder expectations were. And like the reality is these stakeholders have deep intuition for what's happening, right? And one of the things that I encouraged my team to do was like listen very carefully. And that's like the first thing I think as sort of technical folks who are really excited about the things that we're doing and building, it can be easy to, again, sort of like fall back on, well, this approach is technically perfect, right? And let me explain to you why.
Right.
But like actually what we should be doing is listening really carefully to these business stakeholders, because they might give you information that makes your model better. It might be that your model actually is trained on data that isn't right because the experiment you performed had an error, and they're trying to point that out. And so I think listening is a huge part of that process. So.
Yep, that makes sense. Sort of shifting gears a little bit, when you do have supportive leaders, like as a leader, what can you do to build that culture around quantitative reasoning or data-driven decision making?
Yeah, I think like a data-driven culture is the same as sort of like any cultural element. And so I've like gotten to see cultures in extremely large companies as well as like fast-growing smaller companies. And the best way that I've seen culture work is like write it down and live it out. And so what I've seen in large companies is that there can be a lot of writing down and maybe a little bit less living out. Like that's less. It's hard to maintain consistency with a very large organization. I've been pretty excited at HelloFresh because like we do write it down and we do live it out, and so we can actually use those sort of like cultural values to drive conversation. So like one of our cultural values is like egoless. And that actually comes up often in conversations, like, are we approaching this in an egoless way? And one of the other ones is data-drivenness, as we talked about. And are we doing that? And like modeling that as a leader, I think is a really good way to embed that in your culture. The best way to build a horrible culture is write it down and then live out the opposite. That's like a super good way to not build a good culture. So
Yeah,
what do you
that
think?
makes sense. That makes sense. I think what you had called out when we were talking about this offline also is just like there's no specialness about like a data culture, right? Like
Right.
it's the same as developing any kind of culture, right? Like you model the thing you say is important to you. You actually use it to make your decisions. You evaluate people based on whether they're using it to make their decisions. And so sort of just like nailing those fundamentals generally works, right? And like when like the numbers don't agree with your intuition, like do you change your mind? You know, like do you
Right.
demonstrate that willingness to follow the data, or do you kind of stick to your guns? I think that like where I've found resistance to or skepticism,
Right.
because like, there's very few people like today who would say like, I think a data-driven culture is a bad idea. Like let's not do that.
For sure,
right? Like,
right.
You can't imagine many like senior leaders succeeding with that kind of a platform. But I think what you find instead is that there's concerns about like what does it really mean when the rubber hits the road around things like slowness, right? Like there can be this perception of like data-driven culture means analysis paralysis, and so we're gonna like take too long to do anything. And so how do you like make sure that folks don't fall into that? It's very easy, right? How do you make sure that data-driven culture doesn't mean like we torture the numbers forever, but like we think about risk also in a data-driven way and say like, what's the effect if we're wrong? If it's not big, then great, like let's go for it. If we
Right.
have a low, decent confidence, we don't need to be 100%. So using the data to like assess how quickly to move, and not letting it, that there's a fear of loss of control. Right? And so like one area that we face that a bit today is that there's, a sort of cohort of folks who have a whole lot of levers in our system today to override what models are saying, right? And they've had those levers since the models were pretty dumb or there wasn't a model.
Yeah.
It was like a series of like SQL logic that came to an outcome, and it made a whole lot of sense for you to like put business people in place that could say, this looks bad, I don't think it's good, like I'm going to do this other thing instead, right? And as we've gotten smarter models, like we haven't always won the war of like removing the user override capabilities, right? And there's a level of comfort that comes with being able to say like, at the end of the day, if I don't like the number, I'm going to like hit this button and get the number I want, right? And so like, how do you make sure you kind of are fighting that as you go? And so like one thing that's been really useful for us there is setting up a weekly business review process. It's a pretty standard process, right? We sit down with our stakeholders every week, review our products and look at like the estimates that we're making, right? And we have the business owner, not us, speak to each of the slides of of the numbers that we're forecasting. And so if they don't think our numbers are right, like that's the time for them to say, hey, like this doesn't line up with my business, you've got it wrong. They're often right? Like they help us find a whole lot of mistakes that we're making, but by like bringing them into our quality control process and having them flag to us directly where we've got it wrong, that's built a lot of trust and really like enabled, kind of brought them to our side of using data to make decisions over time.
Yeah, I like that. I think just it's interesting because there's sort of like the data component, and let's say like the classic data-driven decision is one driven by A/B tests, and at this point, like it's pretty easy to trust an A/B test. You have some statistical certainty around which, like blue or red.
Some bars are pretty hard.
Fair enough. Like depends on the lift, but but I have found like a significant challenge in that release of control around machine learning, right? And I've seen this all over the place, but an example is we have a discount recommendation model. And sort of the classic way to do discount modeling is you do segmentation, right, which is typically like an intuitive, expert-driven thing. It's typically reasonably manual, although you could do clustering and so on. And then for each of the segments, you ask your experts which discount strategy or which reactivation strategy or XYZ might be good. And then you go. And what we're doing is building a model that like takes out the segmentation and predicts directly from customer attributes what the outcome is. And that's a really scary thing for like our marketing team to deal with, because all of a sudden this thing that they had fine-tuned control over is all of a sudden like being handled by a different process. I'm curious, like, have you experienced that sort of same resistance to that? And is there any particular thing that you've used to help people build trust that like is the right thing to do?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think early on, some advice that I got when I was working at a software as a service company, which is like a very different ballgame, was sort of the person who's accepted, this, a lot of what I've been working on is forecasting, so it's not as A/B testable. I mean, you can
back test it.
Right, yeah.
Sure.
But the person who, at the end of the day, like, you're not the one who owns the P&L, right? Like, in most of these places. And so, like, somebody has to answer, like, when the forecast is wrong for, like, why they made a business decision. And their boss is going to say, why did you, and
right.
They can't be like, well, the machine told me, so I did it, and so, like, how do you equip them such that they're, like, willing to, or able to say, like, yeah, that, I did it. And it could be you, like, go to their boss and get their boss to sign a contract that's like, I just want them to do what the machine says, and then, like, then just don't even have them review it,
Exactly.
Like, don't involve them in the process.
Cut them out of the loop.
Right, and then, like, that's a reasonable way to go in some cases, but otherwise you really got to bring them alongside you and, arm them with enough information that they can defend their choice, and, like, understand what that's got to be. Going back to your point of listening to people, like, what 3 data points do they need to be like, yeah, this thing makes sense? Or listen to them tell you over and over why it doesn't.
Yeah, I think that's I love that. So this concept of educating your stakeholder to the extent that they can actually explain at a reasonable level, like, what is going on.
Right.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be that they get, like, you can use a pretty sophisticated model that they're not trying to explain, like, why the model is, but they can, give them the 3 data points where they're like, these 3 things lined up with what the model said, and that's my process for QAing the model.
Yeah, exactly, right.
All right, I think I'm up next. Yeah, so switching over a little bit to, like, talking about organization and how we build an organization for data science. Like, how do you think about sort of organizing a data science group?
Yeah, there's like a couple of, I've seen a lot of data science groups built poorly, which is helpful. Not very many of them were mine, but so we'll keep that there. And but I've also seen, I think, teams built well, and some of it has to do with, like, realistic expectations. So I forget who talked from McKinsey, but I liked sort of that concept of, like, dip your feet into the water enough that you have enough of an orientation around the space that you kind of know where you're headed. And one of the big ways that I've seen this done poorly is, like, someone will hire a junior, very high potential junior data scientist as the first person that does any type of machine learning or analytics on their team and then hope that the magic will start to come. And the reality is like data science is a complex business, especially in established companies where there already are existing processes and you have to integrate into them, and that's a really complex process, and there's lots of business metrics that are really important. And so for me, like building data science teams starts with hiring the right people first, with the right leadership. So ideally, if you have a leader who can actually establish the vision. So one of the ways I've seen it fail is picking the wrong problem. That's a really, really easy thing to do, and it's probably the easiest thing to do. There's lots of wrong problems for machine learning and data science, and those are often the ones that people are most likely to pick based on something they read or something like that. It might not be applicable to the business. So figuring out the right problem and then building the team sequentially, I think like starting with senior data scientists is usually a good idea because they typically have enough of the breadth of skills that's needed to actually build something potentially useful.
Right.
And like
ideally they've already built what you're looking for somewhere else.
Exactly.
Right? Not like the first person in the room.
Right. They're not the first person in the room, so they know the pitfalls. They know how to avoid sort of getting tangled up with the most complex, newest model, and can sort of go for something that might actually go from there, and then sort of like building the team out from there. Sort of like in my mind, like the second canonical person is like a data engineer, because the first thing you figure out, you're using CSVs or whatever data you can get, a data extract from something, and now you need a data engineer to go prepare that data in such a way that the data scientist can actually be productive in any meaningful way. And then like typically an analyst, right, who sits on top of that team, and this is sort of a forgotten about thing, but how do you measure the performance of what you're doing? How do you characterize the machine learning model? If you're building a complex model, there's like, the hard part is characterization. You can train, a XGBoost model that has wonderfully cross-validated accuracy, but like how does it do in this particular segment of your population? How does it transform over time? And so looking at that, and then all of a sudden you want this thing actually in production versus like sitting in a notebook, either in like your notebook server or somewhere else. And so then you need like an engineering function, and it's like that sort of order. So I like that's how I like to think about it in those kind of stages, and those stages come with maturity. And I think the other thing to think about is that there is a science component to data science, and so like what that means, like data science is not called engineering. There's a thing called data engineering, which is sort of a different thing, and engineering sort of has reasonably deterministic outcomes. I'm simplifying to some extent, but we know that it can be done, and maybe we can't estimate quite how much time super accurately, which is what I find to be often, but you know that it can be done. Data science, sometimes you don't know, actually,
right,
before you've tried it. And so when you're building a team, I think there's like a dwell period, right, that you have to wait. Like don't do early stopping of this team too early, like borrowing a deep learning analogy. Like you want to let it go a couple of iterations and understand that like the scientific process is an iterative one. And so certainly I've seen teams, like I worked with teams in my previous organization who we approached with what was a very reasonable low-hanging fruit machine learning project that could help. And they basically said, oh, we tried this once and it didn't work. Mm-hmm. And then I was like, well, explain how you tried this. Well, we assigned it to an intern and gave them Microsoft Excel. And like they weren't able to build like a model that predicts quality outcomes from a giant amount of heuristic data. And I'm like, cool. So you tried it poorly, and now it failed, and now you don't want to try it again, and that actually happened. So again, sort of going back to how things fail. So.
Right. It's a challenge, though, I think, to set expectations with stakeholders on timing, and so. How do you think about that trade-off between sort of speed to value and scrappy solutions versus like what you're describing here of like it's science and you've got to give it time to bake?
Yeah, I'll say I'm sort of scrappy at heart, which has its advantages and disadvantages. One of the things you mentioned was like actually stakeholder expectation setting. So one of the things we did, like my previous organization, I ran an internal consulting team, and so you're building lots of typically like early stage projects, and you go from 0 to 80% and see what you can do. One of the things that I found really valuable over time was giving the stakeholders an understanding of like what the life cycle looked like, and an understanding that there was an out. So typically what we would do is we would say, look, this week we're going to need to take the data and clean it. This week we're going to build an initial model, and we'll get a warm fuzzy after that, right? And so the warm fuzzy will be, this problem is going to be trivial, and that sometimes pops right out. Like sometimes it's really easy, like we predicted sort of like defect codes for quality documents and trained a model in a week and a half, and it was extremely good. And so it was, there's a little bit of iteration, but sometimes it's really easy. Sometimes it's hard but tractable, right? Like you've got lift, but you're going to have to try like a more complex model. It's going to take a longer time, and sometimes it's impossible. And we would try to get to that point in sort of these scrappy early development projects as quickly as possible, sort of like along the fail fast, along the fail fast domain. One of the problems that we found was if you take scrappy too far out, you get real problems like 6 months down the road. So another example is like early on, this was like early 2018, I was like training models for risk analysis in supply chain, basically sucking in 200,000 news articles and then trying to predict a variety of different risk categories. And I was super lazy and didn't want to label any data. And so I came up with this like extremely fancy, difficult to tune method for like using some data. I applied some heuristics. Basically, Snorkel did this much better than I did eventually. So somebody had mentioned Snorkel today. And like I had this majestically beautiful, extremely difficult pipeline to train that didn't involve much labeled data. And it worked. Like it was reasonable accuracy. It did what we needed. I was very proud of myself. And then 6 months later, the model needed to be retrained. So I was like, oh, wonderful. Now the team has grown. I'm going to assign this to one of our junior members. And it was absolutely impossible to retrain. Couldn't be done. And that sort of scrappiness, it got there. We got there really quickly. We got there with good performance, but we never actually went back and thought, how do we want to productionalize this thing, right? And like what are the attributes of a production model are very different than the attributes of sort of your MVP model, and having people who, to some extent, have seen the pain of their poor decisions in their previous careers, like that load their previous selves is helpful in that process. What do you think?
It can be really tough though when you have something that works to like there's so much pressure to launch at that point, right?
Yeah.
I found that bringing engineering in early helps with that for us. So we try to, like, you don't want to waste engineering time on a project that's going nowhere, but like you can afford to do that once in a while for like the payoff of all the times that like they come in or like, please don't do this in the way you're structuring your prototype code. Like it's going to be horrible or, and so we get them building out components as we go, as we get confident about different pieces so that we, even before we're ready to launch, we've done a lot of the productionalization sort of along the way. It's been awesome in ways I hadn't thought about ahead of time of like our prototyping iterations get like much faster and more efficient because we're using like production quality code in a lot of places in our models at that point. And like the engineering teams actually really enjoy being involved in some of that, like versus the like, here's my notebook, please productionalize.
Make this better.
Model. So that's been good. We've had cases where some engineers like got in and like wanted to try something out and like, that was fun also. But that's been really helpful for us on that kind of like that trade-off. So like scrappy first prototype for sure, like completely aligned there. And then like bringing engineering in has been a good win for us.
I think, what's interesting, I think there's actually a technology component to this as well. One of the things that we found I worked on like, let's say 40 consulting projects, something like that over the course of a few years. And probably about half of them didn't work out for a variety of reasons, right? And then probably 3 or 4 of them were outlandish successes, right? Like extremely high value. And what's interesting, if you look at the amount of effort compared to the outcome, they're not that correlated. So like, it's really interesting. And so one of the things that we found was really useful, especially in that scrappy phase, is get your, call it a model, but let's call it a machine learning driven product, into the hands of your users as quickly as possible because it might be terrible. And if it's terrible, you should know that really soon. And so one of the technologies that we leverage really heavily, so I think like R Shiny pioneered this, but then like Python has like Dash and now Panel and Streamlit, these sort of prototyping platforms where you can, like a data scientist can pick up this skill set over a weekend and build a front end that they don't have to worry about all these API abstractions and all this sort of like security management and so on. You can build an interactive front end that you can get in front of your users really quickly. And we had an example where we had an idea for a tool called like Talent Vector, which basically matches people to internal job recs. It's sort of like a recommender for like retaining talent kind of deal. The idea came over like the course of a couple of sessions. We trained a fine-tuned NER model to extract skills and so on, build a comparison. We deployed an application all within about 3 weeks. And within like 3 months, we had 1,000 users, right? And this is an internal application, so I work on much larger scales now in terms of users, but 3 months for 1,000 users for a company like Lockheed Martin at this point is a big deal. And so it was really interesting to see how fast that was. Like we didn't have to wait for a web development team to go launch a web, and then establish a contract and then deploy everything as an API and do everything full stack React. We could just, a data scientist in a weekend could make that happen. And that's been really helpful to figure out which of those projects actually deserve the investment, right?
Right.
Before you have to pull in, the artillery, if you will, to get everything done. So.
Right, that makes sense. I've done similar things with Excel.
Yeah.
I'm just like, suppose I gave you
exactly,
this thing.
Right.
Like, now what would you do?
What if this worked? Kind of like this, but slightly better.
Yeah, it can be pretty simple. Yeah.
One of the things that I think came up earlier, which is a fun topic, is centralized versus embedded for data science teams.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I'm a bit biased because I've worked on embedded teams throughout my various roles.
Right.
I think they're better. I think that there's a stage where you need a centralized organization. I think when it's early on, you don't have many scientists. You need to make sure that they're being managed well, leveraged thoughtfully, getting the mentorship and the sort of guidance that they need, the resources that they need. You can't have 5 data scientists at a 10,000 person company and have them on different teams. That's not going to be useful. I've found though that because of the need to build the stakeholder trust, because of the need to understand the domain, the value of repeated interaction, that once you have sufficient mass to start sort of putting teams together with durable missions in the business, that you get more traction with like executive stakeholders that way. They when it's like an internal consulting team that's free, like everyone's got something for them to work on. Right. They're not necessarily going to like pony up the engineering resources at the end of the day to do anything with it. And then from the perspective of being an embedded science team that's had like kind of an internal consulting science team come along and be like, hey, we built this like really cool thing that's so much better than what you're doing today. Like, wouldn't you like to adopt it? It can be tough for them to make that case successfully because they don't have all the nuance, right? So you can like easily be like, well, here's the 5 reasons that's not going to work. Or like they're not going to live with it, right? It's kind of like the usual consulting challenge of like they don't have to maintain it after, you can't call them up. They're not going to like be the one they don't have a pager that's the one that like goes off when the thing breaks, right? So I see when it's needed, and I've like seen it be successful in those cases for sure. And I know you've spent a lot of time on central teams, so I'm ready for you to come back with the like, here's what's awesome about it.
Yeah, no, I've seen both, right? So I was on an embedded team as sort of the only data scientist, right? And that's like a lonely job,
right?
And it's tough because there's all this opportunity. And it's pretty obvious. I was in a super data heavy domain, and so the opportunity was pretty obvious, but it was very difficult to get support, very difficult to get the right tooling. People just didn't understand that, and that was a frustrating process for me. I ended up like being on a central team in my next position, and I also can see, I've also seen really well what central teams do poorly, which is like completely lack business context, focus, like be technology focused versus outcome focused. That's a real temptation of these kinds of teams. And so I think you can manage that. And I will say, as a part of central teams, it was easy to find people who were isolated, who wanted to be around other folks.
Right.
And so that like was huge. So the team that I'm building at HelloFresh is a centralized team, and we're trying to balance that. And I think right now our goal is to centralize, and that allows us to establish best practices, like build the tool stack that you actually need to put things into production, like build a way to do this, because sometimes you need critical mass and you need some horsepower to get some of those things done. But I think over time, as the company matures, like a more embedded model will make sense. So the centralized tool stack probably still needs to be there, because a lot of people are in need of the same sorts of things. But over time, and like if you look at sort of the data-centered AI movement, I think if you think about that, what that means is that the machine learning will get closer to the people who have the intuition around the data that's going to take to improve the modeling process. Right. And all of a sudden, as the tools mature, I think the modeling will become less of a difficulty in certain domains. In certain domains, I think it'll remain quite difficult. As the focus shifts to the data, you absolutely need that subject matter expertise. That's where you can improve your data, your feature engineering, the way that you've framed the model, all that stuff. So,
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Do we have other questions? Oh, one question I always like to ask is sort of, how do you keep your skills sharp in industry? Like, as someone who's a practitioner, how do you sort of stay aware of what's going on?
This is like a fun question. It's pretty tough to do. I mean, the field moves really, really fast. It's like almost light speed right now, and I think it's going to keep doing that. My favorite way is podcasts. That's one of the ways that I actually kind of got into the field. And the nice thing about podcasts is like the medium is interesting. So speech without the ability to write down math or show a bunch of pictures forces you to communicate in a way that is intuitively understandable through that medium. And I think that just makes it a really nice way to conceptually understand what is going on without having to work through the fine details. That's especially useful in the role that I'm in now, because like the conceptual understanding is really important. Like often I'm framing the problems, establishing the architecture, and the actual mechanics of how it's done are less important for me right now. So I have like a variety of podcasts that I listen to. I also like read papers. I'll read a couple papers a week. I used to be on Twitter, and I had to get off because it made my mental health more poor. But Twitter's a nice way to like stay up to date. Like nothing's faster than Twitter around communicating new stuff. How about you?
Yeah, I have a different strategy. I like podcasts. I use the like junior folks on my team, right? I mean, like there's no like they're just. I've been listening to Andy Grove's book on from like on Intel and like high output management. It's called, right? It's like an oldie but a goodie. And one point he makes that was like very relieving to me to hear. Just like the best technologists at any kind of like technology company. Are the most junior people, right?
Sure.
Like they just came out of school. Like they've, that they have been thinking about the latest and greatest for the last 4 or 5, however long it took them to get their degree.
They're still
right?
psyched too.
Right. Yeah. And so like they know like they're just always going to be better than me, right?
Yeah.
On the like pure technical skills, and I'm better off just knowing that, and like realizing that I know other things they don't, and like we're going to marry those two together. So I like to just go talk to them, right? So I'll ask, I'll get them to spend an hour like doing a deep dive on their model with me, right? And like I just ask all the embarrassing dumb questions that I don't, like what does that mean? I don't know. Like, explain this to me, and they love it, right? They're just completely dunking on me, like whatever. They're like double skip manager, and they're like, you fool, I mean, as long as completely undermine their confidence in your ability as a leader.
Right. You have to maintain some technical competence.
Use jargon correctly, but it's great for them to get to, practice explaining to me what they're up to. And then, it's a great opportunity for me to learn like what people are doing, and like what the latest is. And I find I always want to read the papers and I really don't have time for it, but I can like schedule an hour meeting and like make that happen. And I won't cancel it because I'll feel bad because I know they've been prepping for it or whatever the case might be. So that's been my favorite way.
That is great. No, I agree. I think I can remember the time when I transitioned to where I would tell people cool things that they should look at.
Right.
To people told me cool things that I should look at. Like my team found Cat Boost, which is a really useful model we use all the time. Yep. And I was like, oh, that was cool. And I didn't even have to read a paper. Like they read it for me. And so I love that. And then on the concept of asking stupid questions, I like to preface my stupid questions with my whole team by saying, this is the dumbest question ever. Please forgive my absolute ignorance. But, and then go on. So
I just jump in,
Just make it happen.
Just go for it.
Yeah. Cool.
Are we at question time? It seems like maybe over question time. Yeah. Happy to answer questions from folks.
I've got a simple one. Which podcast do you listen to?
I've listened to a few, like an old podcast that I think is really good for the technical details. It's called Talking Machines. It's a little old right now. That's a good one. Right now, we're building out our MLOps infrastructure, so MLOps community is a really good one. And then in terms of like optimizing yourself as a human, the Huberman Lab podcast is like unbeatable for that, but it's not machine learning related.
Nice.
So.
I listen to no machine learning related podcasts. I listen to a lot of running podcasts. I'm an ultra marathoner, and so
that's awesome.
I like to listen to those. And all the typical NPR stuff, Freakonomics.
Sure.
Those ones. But yeah, I haven't been using podcasts for my data or my technique literacy.
Right.
I will now look into those that you mentioned.
Yeah, you should take a look.
Hi, great. This has been awesome, by the way. So do you normally, when you're kind of starting up an effort, do you normally sort of build a pipeline of things that, that might go after to discuss with management? Do you have them kind of say, like, what do you think is possible? And then, when you get that sort of list of potentials, how do you narrow that down to, fertile ground of things that are high chance of success and then like a high impact to effort ratio type of thing? So the quick wins and that kind of aspect.
Sure. I try to start those conversations with like a vision doc, like a pretty, like 2-pager, like I can build you this thing. Is this what you want? Right. Sort of, and then break it down from there in order to, and usually like that takes 1 or 2 iterations, right? Usually people are like, oh no, like I actually didn't mean that. I want this other thing, or, and like you haven't wasted much time on all the discovery and whatever else at that point. And then break that down into like, here's the core capabilities we need to do that, right? And the key questions we have to go out and answer, and sort of think about what order can I build up those capabilities in terms of speed to value, and how can I quickly answer the questions, to your point, to say like what the level of effort is really going to be, and get like some of that, like often the quick wins there's no model needed, right? It's like very simply exposing some data or just like kind of changing someone's mind on something.
Yeah.
I often, sort of going back to what you were saying, I often start with the data and start with the data engineering and kind of say to the person like, great, what data do you have? Like, and what investment are you going to make first? Like you need to do this before we even start with science, because if you're not willing to do that, like we can stop talking about it now, like not in a nasty way, but just like if you don't have like some kind of data available, and so like one of the roles I took, I spent a year before we did any science. I was getting data engineers in place, building out the pipelines, saying like your data quality is all terrible. Like, let's talk about what data as a product means. Like your upstream systems aren't taking you seriously as a customer. They don't even tell you when something fails. And so like getting that going, bring in some analysts, to your point, to start the dashboarding, and then like a year in, you can talk about like, let's get a causal economist in here to start, answering the question you actually want to go after.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I love that model. I would say like there's an interesting thing in sort of stakeholder management and project discovery or product discovery in this phase where, like if you think about typical like front-end web design, let's contrast it with that. It's pretty reasonable for people to intuit what's possible within the context of a front-end web development process. Like most people have used them often enough that like the scope of reality is like known, it's shared. That's not the same thing with machine learning, depending on how mature the organization is. And so some of that, like, so I find that like there's two sort of keys. One, I think typically the best projects are one where the scope is jointly developed with the subject matter expert and somebody who understands machine learning. And there's got to be a bit of mutual exchange of information. Like the machine learning person, data scientist or whatever you want to call them, has to transfer enough knowledge about what's possible in the machine learning space cast into their domain such that they can start to reason about it, and vice versa, right? The subject matter expert has to explain to the machine, they have to have a working model of the operations, and we've got various processes that I've used in the past to do that, but you know, building that up front is like really important. And so it's very different. Like what I find is it's difficult to find people who can actually have that conversation because you need a combination of folks who can communicate to external stakeholders in meaningful ways and do that translations. It's a bit of a language translation process, but also understand the technical depth, like the structure that lies underneath the plans that can actually make it possible. Because some things, again, are impossible or super bad ideas, right? And so, you know, that's part of the process. And I would say, like, historically, I've taken a bit of a different approach, and I think it depends on the business environment. If you're in a business environment and, like, your funding's secure and, like, you have way too many things coming in, I think getting buy-in is really important. And, like, well, you have to take one step for me to take that step and so on. If you're in a different business environment where your funding's less secure, you have to show value really quickly. And so in that environment, it's like, do whatever is necessary to show that there's something in this data. And often that's like pull an extract of 10,000 files, do the data cleaning really quickly, show a canary model that kind of demonstrates the value, and then you can get the buy-in, right, from there. So.
Hi, my name is Roy from Vistaprint. I wanted to go back on data-driven culture for a second because there's something that we really, as a cultural norm, so when we talked about writing down cultural norms and living up to them as a reinforcing thing within companies, one of ours is inversion of control for data. And so what that means is recognizing that data product teams or other BI teams are essentially, could be limiting in the way that they could develop features and functionality. And so you want to invert the control to the business. You want your business users really driving those platforms. And I'm just curious, is it something that you would recognize within your own organizations? Because it's candidly still early days for us. We're not quite sure like how that will look over time relative to, you know, frameworks or guardrails there to keep people still guided in their data-driven discoveries. But I would just love your thoughts on inversion of control as a principle within data-driven organizations.
Can you, before you give back the microphone, like when you say you give the controls to the business, like what does that look like? Or what are they responsible for?
Yeah, I think the basic levels of that are just configurable dashboards or signing up to auto alerts or things that they can basically subscribe to themselves in order to explore data and then feel they have an informed opinion about what's going on around them. I think the provocative views would be things that are more parameterized models that they could drive themselves. They could actually do more scenarios and then come back to the teams with, I was exploring this and I came across a surprising finding. That's not where we are, but that's the logical progression of that kind of philosophy, I think.
Got it. Interesting. Yeah, I'll give you some random variety of thoughts, and you can tell me if I'm even close to answering your question. So one thing that I've suffered from myself is when the team that owns the data isn't directly suffering the pain of bad data quality, right? And so it's like I'm the model, that catches the fact that the upstream data generating process is broken and all my users yell at me and, there's nothing I can do about it. And I can, oh yeah, I had the alert that told me it was bad and I went and yelled at them and, that was my whole process. So that, I'm not sure that what you're describing sets up for that, but like that feels like a potential risk there. I think that on the other hand, like having the ability to create your own views on the data as the business team is super critical. And so if that's what you're describing, that makes sense to me, and we use that pattern regularly. And so there's like BI teams supporting the business that give them that capability exactly. In terms of the sort of farther future vision you were discussing, that totally makes sense to me as well. We are building a system like that now, really for our COO, but I mean for some of the folks reporting, where like he will have the ability to say, I want to run simulations with however many different parameters I can, look at the business outcomes, pick the one I like the best, and tell you that's how I want to tune the model for the next month, right? And that kind of goes back to this like business intuition plus data, driven culture, and we have our own stuff under the hood to like feel good about any of those scenarios being picked, right? But like for sure, like bringing them into the process and still like allowing a human in the loop, right? In terms of some of that, can make a ton of sense. I think where you always want to be careful is that your like scientists or analysts or whomever it is don't have to explain to too many different people like what they're doing and why, or like why that's a bad idea, like the thing you're suggesting. And sort of like that's a quick way to lose people from your organization if they like have to answer too many stakeholder questions or critiques. And so I've found so like the whole idea of like everyone can poke around and now everyone has an opinion is another risk. And I found that specific forums where that happens, or a Slack channel or whatever it might be, that kind of contains that, and having managers or people in place who are quick to shut down like when the like VP comes and like talks to some fresh grad about why or like any of those kinds of things, then you're good. You can get around that with mechanisms.
Yeah, I think just two quick things. One is like govern harder early and then release that governance, because if you have very loose rules, it's hard to like get the cat back in the bag, and it's really complicated. So that would be one. And then one of the things I mean, the biggest point is the one you already made, which is sometimes data generators, people who are generating the data, don't understand the implications of them not doing their job well. And that's not typically like out of maliciousness. It's like out of, they don't get that like, a data quality issue here has like downstream effects, and so there can be some animosity. One of the things we've done is sort of like have bronze, silver, and gold level standards for different data sources, so that people actually understood. Bronze is like people use at your own risk. Gold is like people actually understand that multiple production downstream processes are dependent on this, and there's a set of standards that applies to sort of those data sources. So I think getting there faster is better. So. Yeah.
I actually had a question. I'm curious. You mentioned the like lone embedded data science that feels lonely. That really resonated with me.
I feel for you.
I've been in that position, and it's super exciting when there's a whole organization that wants your help in something that's really fun and exciting, like machine learning, but also overwhelming. And so similar to the questions I was asking when we were preparing last week, what advice do you give to that person, and to both ask for help, but also to best support the limited time that they have?
There's a couple of levels to answer that question. So, like one level would be what advice would I give to the senior executives who are in a company where there are lone data scientists? And the biggest advice is mentorship, right? Easily. So if that person has one mentor, and typically these are people not within their organization, that can be so huge. Just anybody to bounce your ideas off of. And like I've had it described where, because I go hunt for these people in organizations. I like try to find the people stuck under the rock. And they'll often say like, it's so nice to have somebody who speaks my language. And so like build a mentorship program for your company, right, is kind of the first one. And then the opposite also applies to that particular individual. Go hunt for a mentor in the company. I remember when I first did this within the context of one of my previous positions, and I just literally found somebody random with the title of data scientist, and I randomly emailed them, and they were super awesome, and they taught me about T stochastic neighborhood embedding, and like we use that for like lots of cool stuff, and I like felt freedom as a part of that. So like I think just seek out a mentor is so helpful. Somebody, like you've talked about this before, but somebody who knows how to do the thing that you're trying to do. It's like incredibly refreshing to have any direction, because there's literally infinite choice at every step in the process in machine learning. Like how many different models did we talk about today? Right. And like there's probably one you should start with, and like you're probably not going to find that on Medium, right? But somebody might know who, you know.
Right. Yeah. I think the other player I would be looking to identify is the advocate, right? And so it's like you need somebody who is going to know the tooling you need, know why it took so long for X to happen, know why you can't do Z, and like who can credibly speak to your manager or your manager's manager and like tell them that you're right, you know, or that you're wrong when you're wrong, and like get you that feedback too. But like who's gonna, you know, sort of, because you're not going to be able, you know, there's always, like, people never understand why it takes so long to clean the data, right? It always seems like too long. And some people really are taking too long and other people aren't. And so you need, like, really should be your manager making sure they have that person to go sanity check what you're saying. But if your manager's not doing that, you should do that, like, find that person and get that going for you so that you have someone else to say, like, it could be your mentor. You know, you could be two birds with one stone, but that's also important.
Yeah, no, totally agree. That advocate's huge.
Thanks.
Thank you. I have a question you brought up earlier about listening to the stakeholders, right? Let's say you're listening to the stakeholder and they're describing their problem to you, and all of a sudden you realize there isn't actually a much deeper problem that you can solve. They don't see it yet, but you see it, and it would make their life a lot easier, and it's something attainable. Can you speak to that a little bit, how to manage that?
It's like most of the time, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I think most of the
every
time,
engagement.
and like it's probably true for all of us, right? You're asking for help because you don't quite know what you need, and you can kind of say like, "Here's my problem," and like someone else is like, "Actually, your real problem is this," right? Which is everything from like marital advice to like data science problem, and so it's like very common. I think that's where I found these kind of documents that are like at Amazon we call them these PRFAQ documents, right, where it's like, here's the cool thing I'm going to build and like what you're going to be able to do once you have it, you know, right. And sort of like aligning on that piece of it is a good chance to sort of pivot a bit from like, you directly asked me for this one thing, I think what you want is this solution, you know, are we aligned that that's actually the thing you want? And then go from there into the conversation about what that means. You need to, you know, the steps you need to take. But I don't know.
I totally agree, and I love like drawing the picture of what you're going to build is like so huge, and it doesn't have to be complicated. Like one more just thing to add. So often I agree, you find that the actual problem that people want to solve isn't the problem that they should be solving, and so that's a really common occurrence. But one of my big things is like building trust, right, in the business, and like that's massive. And so sometimes what that means, what that has meant in the past, is solving a problem that you know is a minor problem so that you can demonstrate to the stakeholder that your team can execute, that you're trustworthy, that you empathize with what they want, that you hear them.
Oh yeah.
And then like I can't tell you how many times like you like creak the door open, you understand a little bit of the problem, and maybe you can see back behind there, but you can't fit. And then you solve that domain, and then it all opens up. And so like
Right.
patience is huge, and then just realizing like the business is built on trust, and like machine learning is a scary thing for lots of people. And so being like patient and playing the long game
Yeah,
to some extent.
incremental progress for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never succeeded by saying, "Oh, great, I'll come back in a year with that." You know.
Yeah, I'm
Let me just
solve your
let-
actual problem in 6 months that you don't actually know
Right,
about.
right,
so,
right. See you later. Yeah, constant communication more than you like is generally required.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much.